Well, I'm excited, Jeff. Thank you for coming. This will be great. And for everyone who's here, I appreciate everyone's time. I know everyone is busy. I am not going to go into a big rundown of his career because that's part of his discussion that he's going to do. Just a quick story. I was teaching my cybersecurity class. This was about 4 years ago. And after class, the student would come up to me and goes, well, you know, I talked to my father about this. So after about the fifth time of saying, I've talked to your father, I said, well, who's your father? Well, he works for Department of Commerce and he's a cyber guy. I go, can I have his phone number? So because of that, I've been working closely with Jeff for 4 years. He's got a wealth of experience. One, I'll do the highlight and he'll say it again. He is a Boston University graduate, which is really cool. But he has time in the private sector. He has time working in Congress. He has time working in the executive branch. And he has time working at a think tank. So we have someone with this huge breadth of knowledge dealing with cybersecurity. And as most of you know, at least those of you that are taking deterrence or cybersecurity courses, all you need to do is open up your email about every hour and you will find out about a new cyber event that's happened in the United States. So over to Mr. Greene to get going, and then we'll really looking forward to everyone's question and answers during this period.
Great. Thanks, Professor Weinstein. Thanks for the chance to be here. The job you left out, that is the one I mentioned the most, was the paid escort job. I worked my way through college as a paid male escort, I like to say, but it was the Boston University escort service. That's what they call it. No one's laughing.
Yeah.
It usually gets a laugh. So I guess everyone's like, what the hell is he talking about? But no, so when I did go to BU, 86 to 90, I worked my way through it. I loved it up here. I graduated from what was then the Department of International. It was not even a department when I started. It became a department 1 or 2 years in. So that was an interesting process to be part of that. Really great timing for me. I was interested in studying the Cold War and finding a Soviet-U.S. related job in 1990. I graduated and the Cold War was over. So I got a couple of jobs in my field, working as first selling copiers and then selling bicycles. So I'm going to talk about a couple things. I'm going to talk a little bit about my career path, which was quite windy and unplanned. And then I'll talk a little bit about cybersecurity, mainly focusing on critical infrastructure, talking about some of the threats that are out there today that we're working on. And also what I think we can do about it going forward. And I am going to work off notes. I apologize. Did not have as much prep time this weekend because of every hour you pick up the paper, there's something happening. Went to BU. After BU, I was working at a law firm. I was working at a bicycle shop, and I started playing beer league hockey, beginner hockey. I got interested in it here, and I met a man who became my mentor who was an attorney. I had never thought about law school. I used to mock my roommate in college because he wanted to go to law school. So I got interested. I went to law school. I spent 9 years practicing law. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. It is a great way to train your brain. But I also knew it's not something I wanted to do forever. And there was a point at which I was ready to move on. I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I started looking on the Hill. I started looking in federal agencies, and I was in process to work in one agency, and you had to go through a whole background to get there when Hurricane Katrina happened. And I've been talking to enough people on the Hill, and when I was a lawyer, I worked on civil and criminal fraud cases, so I did a lot of investigative work. And one of the people I'd met with called and said, hey, we're doing a Katrina investigation. Are you interested? And I'm like, okay, I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and an infant, and I will take a 70% pay cut for a 6-month term job. Sure, no problem. It was not the wisest financial decision I made, but career-wise, it was a great move. I had the attitude that things would work out in the end, and in weird paths they did. So I went to the Hill, worked on the Katrina investigation. I went back and forth between the House and the Senate, then 2005 to 2012. And in 2009, I was working on counterterrorism, defense issues. A colleague came by my office and said, you're a lawyer, right? And for any of you who go to law school, you'll get that question somewhat frequently, and usually it's one of 3 things. They got a DWI, they're getting divorced, or they're buying a house. I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure it's the latter one. Deb's buying a house. And she said, no, we need help on one small piece of the senator's cybersecurity bill. And I had heard cybersecurity a little bit when I started on the Hill in '05. There was one random guy in the corner who worked cybersecurity for Senator Jim Langevin. If you look into the history of cyber policy, Congressman Langevin, he is one of the first people to focus on this, but it was like, what's cyber? So I said, sure, I'll help out. And within a couple months, I had given away all my issues. Your portfolio as a congressional staffer are your stock in trade. It's like gold, you trade it. I gave away everything I was doing to some colleagues and started doing cybersecurity full time. And it was really dumb luck because it was just starting to pick up as a national issue then. And we ended up being the focal point, working on what would have been a significant reorganization of the federal government, creation of some requirements for critical infrastructure. And sort of one of the lessons career-wise I would take from this is that luck plays a big part in it, but it's what you do with the lucky opportunities that came your way. I remember as I got into this and I saw what I thought it was going to be, summer of 2010, we were working on this bill. I went home and I said to my wife, like, I'm going to be gone all summer because we're going to be working on this. But this is likely something I could work on the rest of my career and is really interesting. And God bless her, she's like, great, I'll take care of the kids. And I worked a lot of hours that summer. And it still amazes me that I'm here today, 15 years working on this. So I was on the Hill doing this, and then my boss was retiring. And a friend of mine who had gone to the private sector, a cybersecurity company, reached out and said, hey, we're creating a position to work cyber policy. Are you interested? So long story short on that, I went and did that, and I ended up in one of the biggest, it was at the time the biggest US cybersecurity company called Symantec, and ended up running their government policy and partnership. Still engaged pretty closely with the government, but working on the private sector side. Towards the end of 2019, the company was getting bought. I knew I didn't really want to stick around through that. And that's when I went to the Department of Commerce, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I was fortunate enough to get a position at something called the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. I was the director of that, where we worked with the private sector in trying to come up with solutions. And about a year into that, a colleague I'd worked with a little bit was named the Deputy National Security Advisor for cybersecurity and emerging tech in the White House in the beginning of 2021. And she called me and asked me to come work in the White House. So I started there like late February, early March 2021, and stayed through the summer of 2022, which was a somewhat eventful time. We started out working on what became a pretty significant cybersecurity executive order. Then ransomware really blew up as an issue when the Colonial Pipeline attack happened. The president was engaging with Russia. And then, so what I did, so the cybersecurity directorate is broken into two pieces. There's our boss, the NSA Neuberger, and then there's an offensive and international side and a defensive side. And I ran the defensive side. A good friend of mine ran the offensive side and the international piece. At some point during 2021, when it became clear that the Russians were going to invade, we became really worried about what could happen if we and our allies sanctioned the Russians economically, what they could try to do to our critical infrastructure. So that was probably the busiest stretch of my life from late summerish, early fall through when I left. And I still remember when, and a lot of this wasn't public, and sometime in December was the first big article where the US pushed out declassified a bunch of intelligence, said, yes, this is what the Russians are doing. This is going to happen. And I remember my wife saying some version of, now I know why you've been working so much. And it was nice to be able to talk about that. I was pretty tired after a year and a half of that, ended up at a place called the Aspen Institute, the think tank, and I got to look at cybersecurity from a policy perspective. And I should say none of this was really planned. Like every job I've talked about was usually through people I had known and become friends with. The same thing with Aspen. I was going back to commerce. I had kind of three roles I was going to fill. And a friend of mine at Aspen said, no, you should really come help us build an international program. So that was both a good opportunity to think about cyber academically as opposed to operationally. and also to recharge my brain, but also it positioned me in a different place where I was interacting with people who before had been somewhat my senior. And fast forward to this April, I'm blanking on the days, but a colleague of mine who I met when I was at the NSC, she'd gone from the FBI to Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, said, hey, the head of our cybersecurity director is leaving. Are you interested? And I had thought about it a bit because I'd gotten a tipper a couple days before that she might call. And I'm like, yeah. So this was a Tuesday night. By Thursday morning, I talked to the director. They'd called the White House. And so I got this text, good news, the secretary called the White House, you're in process. And I remember looking at the text thinking, I don't remember saying yes. But at that point, it didn't matter. I would have said yes. So that's kind of how I got where I am. So my role is in CISA, I'm the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity. I have to read it because it's such a long title at CISA. So my division is about 1,200 people, $1.5 billion roughly budget. And what we do a number of things. The two biggest things at the top level is we're responsible for security of the federal civilian executive branch, the FSEB agencies. So anything non-military, non-IC. They all have their own chief information security officers, but we have the ability to push directives out. We have the ability to see across a lot of what they're doing, which is somewhat new. I can get into if we get to that. But we also work with the private sector, critical infrastructure, cybersecurity. The vast majority of our our critical infrastructure is privately owned. We also work with our state and local, territorial and tribal partners to help push out information. We don't have regulatory authority there. We are purely a voluntary agency, which both gives us opportunities and challenges. We talk internally about what is the best model going forward. I think we've done a lot with what the voluntary model can bring, but the day-to-day is focusing on a variety of those issues. So we sit in this unique space where we're not the intel community, we're not military, we're not law enforcement, but we work with them every day. Like literally this morning before I went to Professor Weinstein's class, I went down to our offices here and got on a call with all of them about something that's going on right now. And we are close partners, operational partners, and that has evolved over the past 10 years. Before I break off the career stuff, and I'm happy to take questions on it, there's this thing they tell you to do when you're speaking, which is to give people a list of 3 things. So my list are 3 things that I would tell you to take to any job, things that I've tried to take with me that I think have helped me get to this weird place. Again, no planning. The first is keep your common sense front and center. Too often you'll find people when they get in jobs will divorce themselves from the real world and the work they're doing. From the first day of law school, they drilled that into us. So keep that in mind. The second was from when I was a baby lawyer. We had a client development talk from the founder of our firm, and everyone had told us, be excited, he'll come in, it's this great speech. And he literally walked in and said 2 words. He said, be nice. That was his client development talk. He said, that is how you make relationships. That is how you develop clients. I could list multiple times in my life where job opportunities came my way because I had given a little kindness or help to someone along the way, stopped for an extra couple minutes. So that is it. But the other thing about being nice, this is my codicil, is you're nice until you need not to be nice. Because if you're generally a nice person, you treat people well, when you do get frustrated or annoyed or put your foot down, it carries a lot more weight. And that's how I operated in the White House. Very amenable. I like to think to what the agencies were talking about, very open, pretty flexible, the old pick your battles line. When I chose to pick a battle, I think it carried a little more weight because I wasn't fighting over every comma or semicolon. And the final thing I would say is embrace your imposter syndrome. I don't trust many people who don't feel some sense of imposter syndrome, no matter where they are. For me, it makes me prepare a lot harder. I always feel like everyone in the meeting belongs there and I don't. It also makes me willing to say I don't know, which is really important. I think when you tell people you don't know or you're asking questions, you're showing some strength. But I feel it all the time. I feel it sitting here in front of you guys. Like, who am I for you to listen to? But that's really important. And then actually one other thing I would say is which I'm violating right now, which is to listen. There's an old saying that you never learn anything when you're opening your mouth. So sit back and listen to people. So that's it on the career stuff. We can talk about that if you want. I was going to turn now to talk a little bit about where we are in the cyber world. I'm going to refer to notes a little more aggressively here because we're limited in what we're supposed to say. But I'm going to open up by talking a bit about the current cyber threat landscape, what we see going on. Short version is that it's not pretty. There's a lot of bad activity out there, but it's also not hopeless. I think far from it. Critical infrastructure is more susceptible to cyber threats than it ever has been. That happens when we connect devices and connect things that were built long before there were connected computers. Imagine, 40, 50-year-old life cycle on a power generator is now connected to iPhones and apps. And we were talking earlier, if you don't have the physical capacity to go turn something on and off, you have limited your resilience, your ability to work through a digital outage. Security perimeters today, even when you talk in the digital world, are basically gone. You cannot rely on the cliche of the hard exterior. You have to assume compromise and know what you're going to do when the bad guys get inside. Are folks familiar with the SolarWinds compromise? Does that ring a bell? That was the end of 2020. We uncovered that the Russians had compromised the company called SolarWinds and had used their supply chain, their patching system, to deploy malicious software across the federal government. And actually, I think the public was over 20,000 entities had downloaded their update that was compromised. That was a big wake-up call for us, but that I think shows you how even the most important systems, patching and updating, are also being used by our adversaries. Another one was the Colonial Pipeline, I may have talked about a minute ago. That was the summer of 2021. When major East Coast pipeline, their information technology systems were compromised. The operational systems that ran the pipeline were fine. But depending upon what version of the story you read, they either did not have confidence that they could keep an infection from spreading, or they couldn't tell who they were billing, so they shut the whole pipeline down. Maybe it was a combination of both. That's a real problem when an IT compromise like that leads to gas shortages, which also leads to a separate issue we can talk about, societal panic. People freaked out and were running to the gas stations. There are insane pictures of people filling up like plastic grocery bags with gasoline. You can find, this is real. People were doing this until we had to put out advisories, don't put gas in a trash bag. But we in the White House were looking at Gas Buddy to try to figure out where there were shortages. That's the level of visibility, and that's the value of the private sector. Come to learn later that Gas Buddy was wildly incorrect. Another attack vector you have to think our adversaries could do if they want to freak us out. But the adversaries we're talking about are nation states. They're criminal gangs. They are nation states that act like criminals. They are criminal gangs who are either actually nation states sometimes, potentially, or are criminal gangs working on behalf of nation states. They are constantly evolving their tactics, whether it's for espionage, for disruption of critical systems, or for financial gain. You'll often hear us talk about the big four cyber actors: Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, and they're all differently problematic. They all pose evolving threats. The DPRK, mostly we talk about as a financial threat, but I think we shouldn't be limited there. Russia, very focused on the war in Ukraine right now, but not entirely, still a threat we need to worry about. With respect to Iran, there's been recent reporting about them trying to take out some of our, impact some of our critical infrastructure, also some reporting about potential election activity. But the big one that I want to drill down on is the PRC, People's Republic of China, and what they have done, and specifically a threat to critical infrastructure from an actor that is publicly called Volt Typhoon, and there's a bunch of affiliated actors there. Does that ring a bell to folks? Has anyone heard about this? So Volt, and I'm going to read some actual verbiage here, they've burrowed deep into our critical infrastructure, and they have the capacity to launch destructive cyber attacks in the run-up to a conflict. And that's taken from the Director of National Intelligence's annual threat assessment. She's written that the past 2 years. And the actual language is, if Beijing believed that a major conflict with the United States were imminent, it would consider aggressive cyber operations against U.S. critical infrastructure and military assets. Such a strike would be designed to deter U.S. military action by impeding our decision-making, inducing societal panic, and interfering with the deployment of U.S. forces. So we could take all the pieces of that, but the societal panic one is that we're focused on at CISA. We're looking at critical infrastructure, even a short disruption in the power. Every time Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile has a short outage because someone misconfigured a router or a tree falls on a tower, we in CISA get inquiries, oh my God, is this a cyber attack? Is this a cyber attack? And it never is so far, and we always relax, it's okay, but imagine the day when that is a cyber attack, the type of reaction we'd get, or if the water goes off, or if other things happen. And the reason we're so worried is at CISA, one of our roles is in incident response. We have what we call hunt teams that go out when we are worried about an intrusion or someone calls us and says, hey, we have this weird activity. We have seen and eradicated, hopefully, Volt Typhoon actors on U.S. critical infrastructure and water, electricity / power, transportation and communications. We've seen all of this, but the scariest thing is we know that this is the tip of the iceberg. We can't see most of it because they're very good and because unfortunately most of our technology is super susceptible to this. But the scariest piece about Volt Typhoon and what they're doing is historically when you saw cyber actors get an access, they could use it for one of two things. Collection, espionage, stealing information, or potentially for disruption. Thankfully, we haven't seen much of the disruption. The places that Volt are going after have very little to zero collection value. They're going there to pre-position for destructive attacks. That is basically the only reason to go on them. And that is something relatively new and very scary. And as I mentioned, they're very hard to find. These are not the old days of people putting malware or viruses on a system. They're using what we call living off the land techniques. They're taking advantage of flaws in technology, stealing credentials, getting accesses, and then leaving. Oftentimes they're cleaning up what they've done. They're very security conscious. They're very hard to find. One of the reasons why we're pretty confident we haven't seen everything they've done. We're not sitting back and letting them do this. We have pushed out an incredible volume of what in the past would have been highly classified information about where we expect them to go, what we've seen them doing, how they're doing it, how to mitigate. And we're also working with our private sector partners from technology manufacturers to cybersecurity companies. So that's part of why I'm hopeful, because we have really good partnerships with the private sector. We have really good partnerships with our federal partners, whether it's the FBI or whomever. We are talking constantly. We have recognized that all of us need to pool our resources and our knowledge. So what do we do about these problems? I think the biggest thing we need to do long-term is starting with our technologies. We need to expect more from our manufacturers. I said I started on this in about 2009. I went to my first cyber conference in London in 2010. And I have a very clear memory of that conference, not because of anything I learned, but because of some guy I think I saw every day walking around with a t-shirt that said, "There's no patch for a stupid user." And I thought that was really funny. I still think it's a little humorous, but it's also coming at this problem precisely backward. We are all going to click on bad links. We are all going to, I was a lawyer. I worked for the government in the security space. I am about as paranoid by nature and by training as you can get. I will still every few months, as my thumb or finger is coming up, I'm like, what did I do? All of us are going to get conned. Con games have been around since the beginning of time. The problem is that every day and in every way, we are relying on technology that has these fundamental flaws that allow a very human mistake, being tricked by a malicious actor, to be turned into a significant breach. That it means stealing your bank account, taking down critical infrastructure, stealing national secrets. That should not be acceptable. It is insane that we are in a place where we accept technology that is shipped essentially defective. Imagine if I told you the car that you're going to buy after you graduate has several fatal flaws in it. We don't know what they are, but it has fatal flaws in it. And at some point in the future, the manufacturer or maybe someone else is going to discover them. And the manufacturer may or may not fix those fatal flaws depending upon whether they had a good or bad quarter. We would not accept that, and we should not accept it with technology. And it sounds like I'm blaming the tech sector, and I don't mean to, in part because that's how the tech sector grew up. No one envisioned that this technology would be running all of our most critical systems, but we have built both a legal and a societal framework that allows that to go forward, and we need to change that going forward. So within CISA, we have what we call the secure by design approach. It is, we're a voluntary agency, purely voluntary. We've come up with some basic principles that we want companies to follow. We have about 200 signatories on it right now, and it's pretty simple things like using multi-factor authentication, not shipping products with default passwords. And so default passwords mean, I'll give you an example of one of the first critical infrastructure compromises that I remember being publicly confirmed. Roughly 2010, the South Houston Water District was compromised by some kid in Eastern Europe because he had read a poor translation of a statement by the Secretary of Homeland Security. What the Secretary had said is our critical infrastructure is vulnerable. Somehow that got translated as we're secure. So he set out to prove it was not secure, and the way he did it was used a particular search vehicle. It's called Shodan, but it's like Google for connected machinery. Found this one device, queried it and said, what are you? It told him. He then Googled the owner's manual for this device, found the default username and password, logged in and discovered that he had logged into the South Houston Water District's control panel. So he posted a bunch of pictures of that, never did anything. But to me, that's not even a hack. I mean, that's pathetic. But when we talk about default usernames and passwords, that's what's out there. And so we want companies to stop shipping products with those. But it's also disclosing vulnerabilities. We are asking companies both to search for their own vulnerabilities and disclose them when they've patched them so people know to fix them. We are starting to see the positive effect of this pledge in what may sound like a paradoxical way, or we're seeing a big spike in self-reported vulnerabilities. Companies that have taken the pledge are reporting, hey, we found these vulnerabilities, here's the patch for it. But to us, that's a good thing, and those companies deserve praise, because better that they found their own vulnerabilities than an adversary did and used them against us. And it suggests to us that their development practices going forward will be much better. So we hope we're moving towards a new model where consumers can trust the products they buy and the technology that manufacturers that build them, but it's not something government can do alone. We don't have regulatory authority over the tech sector. Candidly, I don't know what that could even look like or how we'd enforce it. So we need everyone, whether it's companies or individuals, to think about security when they're buying products. It doesn't have to be the only thing you're thinking about, but we need that demand signal to go up to industry. What else can we do? Working together, I talked about the partnerships we have. That's the focus of my agency. And in most cases, we don't have the authority to mandate fixes at critical infrastructure. State agencies often have more, but even then it's not always available, but it's also not possible. If you look at the US water sector, there are 6,000 plus entities, many of which are very small, many of which don't have a lot of resources. Many of which have no ability to raise their rates if they wanted to put in more money into cybersecurity. So just telling them that they have to do better isn't going to help. We need to work with them to try to help them elevate, to provide them resources where we can, to give them the simple fixes. But we also need partners to share with us information. We have access to a huge volume of information as the federal government, but we don't see even a small percentage of what private sector companies, whether critical infrastructure or big tech companies, see. So sharing back and forth, and I'm not talking about personal data information, but the type of traffic that will indicate threats. We need to be sharing that. But we also need to be better at talking about the why. Why are we telling entities that they need to do different? Why are we telling you to update your iPhone or whatever with the newest version? Explaining the why sometimes is hard for government because a lot of that has historically been classified. But information sharing is one area that we have significantly improved. When I was in the private sector, there was a developing campaign. They brought a bunch of us who had clearances into a room. They told us this is really bad. This nation state is focused on these particular entities that will then give them access to hundreds or thousands of more of them. So this is bad. And then they're like, okay, meeting's over. And we all looked at them and said, well, this is useless. I know this, but I can't go talk to anyone in my company. My general counsel of my company was cleared, so if I flew to California, I could tell Scott, but Scott couldn't do anything with it either. So we sat around after that meeting with our government friends and said, you need to give us some things that we can talk about on an open phone line. So we came up with some descriptions of the activity, some indicators of compromise, and we could all go out and call our security teams and say, this is what you want to look for. And that worked. But that also was not a repeatable model. It was an ad hoc effort. We are in a very different place today. I can tell you, having watched this from the White House, having watched it now for 4 months at an operational agency, the default is pushing out information. We are not sitting on actionable information that either individual entities could use or sectors could use. When I started, I had read a lot about Volt Typhoon. I worked in the space, and to me, it was fascinating beyond that. It was interesting to see all this stuff in the public. So I asked the team to set up a classified briefing to tell me more. And it was a good briefing, but there was literally nothing in that briefing that the private sector did not already know in terms of how to detect and disrupt this actor. That was incredibly important. There's other stuff, obviously, but the focus there was we were pushing out what was actionable. Same thing with ransomware. We have a program called the Pre-Ransomware Notification Initiative. We have people who work with a variety of different researchers. We learn that an organization is the target of or actively being compromised for a ransomware attack. We have a field force that will go out to them within hours. And in this year alone, we've put out, I think it's over 2,000 this year. I know in the first quarter it was 800. And that's the proverbial dog that didn't bark. Those are entities that were able to stop a ransomware attack before it took hold. We take our duty to warn very seriously. We also co-seal, as we call it, a lot of products. So if CISA or our partners put out a cybersecurity advisory, we'll often do that with international partners, with the FBI, sometimes with the NSA. We are careful about using our brand. We want to put out information that is useful to network defenders. We hope it is obvious that if we're focusing on a particular issue, there's a reason why, and people should take it seriously. But we have shifted from a model of pushing out a mass volume of threat indicators and other activity to focusing on this is what's important, this is what you should do, because the private sector has filled that gap of putting out the bulk of the information. We're also asking entities to join us, companies, in long-term planning, which is not a normal government private sector partnership, but we need to think long-term about how we're going to put protections in place. And within part of my division, it's called the Joint Cyber Defense Collective, or JCDC. My boss was an AC/DC fan when they stood this up, so she named it. The JCDC works with a lot of these entities to do this joint planning. And so I always like to close by talking about what individuals can do. Because when I used to give these talks, when I started at Symantec, I was worried people didn't take this seriously. So I would really harp on how bad the environment is. And I got consistent feedback afterwards that, man, that was scary. I guess we're all screwed, which was not the message I wanted to deliver, because on an individual level, all of us can do relatively simple things to keep ourselves and our data safe. Most of us will never be targeted by a nation state. And if you are not doing things like updating your devices, updating your apps, all the patches you see, having a security software in place, using that multi-factor authentication. And if you're using it, I'm probably thinking of the SMS text messages. Look for other options. SMS is still better than nothing, but that's becoming something the bad guys can exploit. But if you do those basic things, you will be more secure than most people out there. And that's really all you need to be, is more secure than everyone else, because as long as there is a volume of insecure devices out there, the criminals are going to keep compromising them. They didn't go into crime to work hard. So if they can keep doing the same thing, they're going to keep doing the same thing. And they know that when a patch comes out on a device or for software, 50% of the devices probably will never be patched. And so they have a huge target set. And we have seen, it is a given that when a patch comes out, criminals are going to reverse engineer it. We've seen patches, it used to be a week or two to go from patch release to exploit. Now it's days. So when you see patches come out, critical patches, it's important you put them out. But if you do that, you will keep yourself secure. Ultimately, if you work for an organization, government, whatever, you will help that organization be secure. And that little bit of help is what will help get us ultimately over the finish line. There's no 100% solution for cybersecurity, but every little bit is going to help and add up. So that's one of the reasons why we always preach individual responsibility until we get those secure products I talked about. So that's kind of my rant. I'm happy.
No, I really like the discussion about, there isn't a single person I know that's in the government, whether it's civilian or military, that took a path from college to a straight line to all of a sudden they become a senior person. It just doesn't work that way. I got advice when I was a young officer, and it was the same thing as be nice. The advice was people don't remember if you do good staff work or bad staff work. They just know if you're a good person or a bad person. And if you're a bad person, no one will help you. And that's kind of the true story. One more item that I really want to open up for questions. We could start maybe on the career stuff. A lot of things happen by accident in life. I was going to National Defense University. This was in the late 90s. And I got a phone call in the spring, and it said, hey, do you want to enter a program? We're starting a special program called the Information Securities Concentration Program. I go, I don't even know what it means. What is it? Well, we're trying to teach people so they know a little bit about computer network attack and computer network defense. By the way, this is the late 90s, and that wasn't a term that people were using in the late 90s. And I said, sure, what do I have to lose? Right? So all my electives in this school were in computer network attack and computer network defense. For those of you that may take the cybersecurity class, we'll go into great deal on what happened back in the late 90s. But what was really interesting is after 9/11, I'm at United States Strategic Command, and the admiral, the 4-star, comes down to see me, which is very odd. In the military, when a 4-star comes down to see someone junior, that's a bad thing. That means they're going to fire you, or they're going to do, it's really not a good thing. And the 4-star came up to me and said, hey, I'm starting a new division. We're calling it the Information Operations Division, but it's really going to be computer network attack and computer network defense. And you're my most qualified colonel. And I go, oh, Admiral, you must have me confused with somebody else. My name is Jack. He goes, did you take this program at National Defense University? I go, I did. He goes, well, I hope you took good notes because you're in charge. And that's how I got involved in the cyber thing. Just by taking electives, they needed someone to be in charge of a program, and I was the only one that had these courses. By the way, that's happened to students since I've been here, where they were in a company and they found out that someone took a cybersecurity course, and the next thing you know is you're writing law for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So things can actually happen that way. Let's open up for questions, whether it can be on the career stuff or it can be on just the role of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Please.
I wanted to draw an analogy. I've heard loosely that our very decentralized election system is actually a benefit when it comes to adversaries and their ability to attack actual voter rolls and disrupt processes and things like that. You mentioned these 6,000 water companies, and I imagine our critical infrastructure is also, bearing in mind elections are too, but lots of the other critical infrastructure is also decentralized. Is that a benefit when it comes to large-scale coordinated attacks, or is it a little more complicated than that?
That's a very glasses half full view, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, that it would be hard to take down the United States or even the East Coast or even the Maryland power grid. It might not be as hard to take down the water facility that serves a key military installation in a Midwestern or Northwestern state. I'm just picking that randomly. So I think it'd be harder to do a broader societal, but you could still do very targeted attacks, and it's reasonable to conclude, just as when we're doing any type of targeting, you look at where the adversary's weak spot is, that our adversaries have figured out what are the 6, 12, 20, or 50 water, power, whatever, that could have impact on the military's ability to project force or to create panic. But yeah, it would be With that said, though, for those who remember the 2003 power outage, I think it was in Ohio, a tree fell on a power line and New York City went dark for like a day. It was 2 years after 9/11 and people were pretty freaked out, and it was literally a tree falling. Now you'd have to understand to do that, but so we have both strength and weaknesses from the distributed nature of our systems, but the interdependency as well. But it also means you got to go out and protect every single one of them. You can't fix any single one of them, and they all need bespoke approaches typically.
Hey, Jeff, the Congress had the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which looked pretty successful at looking at problems with cyberspace. And I know there's been National Defense Authorization Acts has put in place some of the items from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. What is the government doing, to kind of piggyback on the question, what is the government doing for the mom and pop utilities? I mean, I spent a lot of time in the upper Midwest, North Dakota Power. There's not like, 50 cybersecurity people at this place. The cyber person is probably the same person that handles the gate and that does other items. Is the government providing any support for some of these small companies that are providing such an important utility for the country?
Yeah, I would say on three levels. Number one is CISA, my agency, provides a variety of free services you can sign up for that, you think, oh, free services, what can it do? But if you sign up for, they're called Sci-Hi, cyber hygiene. Some of them are attack surface management, vulnerability scanning. What we will do is scan you give us your IP addresses. We will scan all your public facing, everything basically, and we will report back to you if we're able to detect vulnerabilities to say, hey, we detected X device connected to the internet, that should never be public facing. Or we connected to Y device, but you have it misconfigured and therefore an adversary could get in. So that's one of the things, there are different things we can do. And we will engage with some on a very individual level depending upon their criticality. I guess that's point two. We do some very individual support as the DoD and others. The third thing though, is part of the Relief and Recovery Act in 2021, there was a huge volume of money going out to the states and localities, and one of them was a cyber grant, which is the first, I believe, targeted cyber grant program focused on critical infrastructure. So those small entities can apply to get grants, to hire someone, or to buy new tooling. And one of the things I worked on as I was leaving was putting on the NOFOs, the Notice of Funding Opportunities, to craft those so smaller entities have the capacity to try to get some of that funding to step up their cyber game. Now, the hard part, a lot of times, those can be recurring costs. So that was one of the things we looked at. But that's some of the ways that we have tried to do it, because it will take us a long time to get to a secure product world. And even then, we'll have to replace the products that are out there. So we have to deal with them as they are. But
it sounds like a beautiful internship for a college student that's studying computer science to work over the summer.
There are a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, please.
So I don't know a lot about cybersecurity at all. I'm here because I heard about through a class on nuclear security, and I'm curious. Would you liken cyber attacks similarly to nuclear weapons in the sense that there's not a way to directly defend against them, there's only a way to retaliate, or how would, just to be able to understand the nature of cyber attacks?
So you're jumping into the middle of what was for a while a pretty heated debate, is do we take mutually assured destruction, nuclear policymaking, and overlay it on cyber? I ultimately came out as the no. It felt a little too easy to try to directly overlay. Some of the, I think some of it is applicable. It's much harder to detect the cyber buildup than I suspect it is to detect nuclear or other even conventional forces buildup. It also is more defensible, in my view. It doesn't feel that way every day, but the reason why criminals and nation states, the reason why you see some of our adversaries focusing on this living off the land stuff is because we and others got good at detecting what they were doing before. So every time we do that, we're driving up the cost of doing business for criminals or nation states, so we can defend against it. In terms of how you respond to a cyber attack, we've been fortunate enough not to have destructive cyber attacks within the United States. I think the president has stated several times that we will respond proportionately in the manner and time at which we choose. That gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of how we're going to do it. One does worry about if cyber attacks become more normalized, to have that become an everyday type of thing. So the part of it where I think it fits somewhat with the nuclear analogy is being very cautious about when and how you use them, because we don't want to normalize them. There are norms that the UN parties have agreed to on norms of conduct in cyberspace, I think it's called. There's like 11 GGE norms, global group of experts, and I think 3 are negative, saying you don't attack hospitals and civilian infrastructure. I can't remember the other, and then 8 of them are positive, like you shall pursue cyber criminals, you shall do other things. They're not binding, but I can tell you from experience, we take them seriously in the United States, as do a lot of our allies. And ideally, we follow those, we can limit normalizing them. But you saw, like, we attributed to Russia soon after the February invasion, the full-scale invasion in 2022, the Russians had targeted satellite providers in Ukraine, and they accidentally took out a bunch of satellite providers in Germany that impacted some, I think it was like wind generation. So there are norms, and outside of active war, you don't see a ton.
Yeah, let me just ask you a follow-up, and then I want to, because you've asked a really, really good question.
How do cyber attacks not lead to further escalation? Like if a Russian attack impacts software in the U.S., how does that not lead to an escalation?
Thankfully, we haven't really had. Oh, so you're thinking about like the SolarWinds intrusion? I mean, there's a difference between a destructive attack and espionage, and I think, I can't remember which former CIA, I think it was a CIA director, talking about SolarWinds. Basically, he's like, that was really bad. They stole a bunch of information, but that's what nation states try to do. They conduct espionage, and tip your hat to them for having done a good job here. That is different than trying to break the Federal Reserve or doing something else really bad.
In the military, we try to do exactly what you said, right? We had this organization that did nuclear. And then we said, well, we're going to take the organization that does space and we're going to put it with the nuclear organization because that's strategic, right? And oh, by the way, cyber, that's kind of strategic too, so we'll put them all together. And what we realized was all the nuclear folks start laying every single nuclear plan on top of space and cyber. And while there may be some similarities on being a global domain, they're very, very different. So one by one, we pulled Cyber Command out, and that became a separate entity, and then we pulled Space out to be separate. I took over an organization, and I was responsible for some space items and from cyber items, and I said, hey, I want to see my cyber people. So there's like 20 people in the room, and they're all my cyber people, and I go, hey, but you're a nuclear person. Last time I was here, you were a nuclear person, and you're a nuclear person. He goes, yeah, I didn't want to move to the nuclear base, so I stayed here, and now I'm a cyber person. And I'm getting kind of nervous, and I go, is there anybody in here that can spell cyber? And I had one person that was actually a policy computer science person, where everybody else was a nuclear person. So the military did look at it. Hey, it's kind of the same thing. It's all strategic. We'll all put it together. And while there are similarities, there are more differences. But it's a great question. Please.
Similar to the question comparing cyber and nuclear, we hear these stories about how, some of our weapon silos are still running on like floppy disks, and whether or not those systems should be upgraded to, match the rest of the digital infrastructure the military uses. I guess, what are your thoughts on that? Is there merit to like a system that not can't be hacked, but like doesn't have the same vulnerabilities as our more interconnected systems?
I'm going to answer that a little next to it in the critical infrastructure space, where you have significant critical infrastructure that's still running like Windows 95 and Windows 98. And in that environment, much of it's connected, so that there's no good in that. That's a real problem. But it's also both expensive and disruptive to upgrade it. So it's not like these entities don't know and don't want to do it, but you have to take a system down and do a lot of testing before you put it back up. Also answering it kind of sideways to it, it leads into something that I think is essential that I should have mentioned earlier, which is resilience, which is the capacity to keep functioning through a cyber or digital disruption. The Ukrainians brought their power grid back up in 16 and 17 in Kyiv when the Russians attacked it because they could go to physical controls. And they have shown an incredible capacity for resilience during the war. We are positioned much worse for a lot of that resilience because everything has become digital. Now, a completely disconnected system that's coded in Pascal or COBOL has a lot of security advantages, whether it's more efficient. I think we may have definitely moved into Professor Weinstein's knowledge base if you're able to talk about it.
I can't talk about it. We did have systems that did nuclear communication that used 5 1/4 floppy drives, the big floppy drives. We would have to explain to people, because the checklist would say, insert the 5 1/4 floppy drive. And people didn't know what a floppy drive was, because probably no one in here has ever seen a 5 1/4 floppy drive. We knew we needed to upgrade the system. You can't buy floppy drives anymore. So we had to go on eBay to buy floppy drives until we can upgrade the system. But you're right in the standpoint of an analog system is protecting in a digital world. The problem is you can't build analog systems anymore because companies aren't there to build the analog system. You bring up a really good point, though, that if you look at the nuclear modernization that's happening for everything, it's now being built with a digital backbone. That means cybersecurity has got to be baked at the very, very beginning of it and not at the end, because we're in a completely different environment with everything. Even when people think their systems are not connected, the systems are connected.
Yeah, when I was on the Hill working cybersecurity, I went to visit what was called the Industrial Control System Computer Emergency Response Team of a variety of government experts that would fly out to sites when there was a control system, think big machinery. And this is 2012. And one of the young guys I met with literally had an email, cyberninja@dhs.gov. And Cyberninja told me he'd been to 50 some different entities, 50 of whom had told him that they had their operational technology walled off from the public internet, 50 of whom had unknown connections to the public internet. And what he said he would do, he'd walk in and he'd look for the guy in the work shirt with the little circular name that said Bubba, and ask Bubba, where'd you put the router? Because a lot of times Bubba needs to get access from wherever he is in the building. All of them were connected, and none of them, all of them thought legitimately they were not connected. And if you want to go to the best case study of that for me, you think about Colonial Pipeline. If you assume, and I don't know what the ground truth was, if you assume that they shut it down because they were worried that the infection on their information technology would jump to the operational technology, the pipeline controls. If they had done an exercise the week before and said, hey, we have an IT infection, the chief information security officer 100% would have said, we're good, it's walled off. Because if he or she didn't say that, they're going to get fired because their job is to wall it off. But when the bet the company moment comes, when there actually is an infection, the answer changes. Like, can I really be 100% sure? Am I worried? So there are connections upon connections, and there are devices building connections without human knowledge, which is a whole new set of problems.
If you want to do a little fun homework assignment, you can either think for yourself on where you're living or where your parents are living and count how many items at your house are connected to the internet. And at first I said, well, I don't have that many things connected to the internet. And I actually did this in class. Then I started counting in front of everyone how many items I have connected to the internet. And the number gets like huge. that I was kind of really proud. We had a bad, for those that remember, there was a few years ago, there was a hurricane. It wasn't as bad as what's going to happen in Florida, but we had a hurricane out here and we lost power for a long time. And I said, that will never, ever happen again. So I have a whole home generator now at my house with an app that lets me turn it on from the phone, which means if I can turn it on from the phone, that means someone else can turn it off. Because it may be secure, but it's probably not as secure as it needs to be. So just do a little experiment to think how many items are connected to the internet just on your own personal devices, and the number gets astronomical.
So true story, I stayed at a friend's house in Vermont this weekend, and I got up in the middle of the night, tried to get a glass of water, and there was no water. Like, what the hell? And I didn't think to look at my phone. I got up the next morning, there was a text, the sensor detected an open water spigot, so we have shut the water off. And they were back in DC. So they had turned the water off in their house in Stowe, Vermont from DC because they had been alerted to, the system turned the water off. So they got an alert saying the system turned the water off because it detected an open valve. Can you check to see? And then we'll turn it back on. But I'm at like 3 a.m. like counting how many toilets there are, so to know how many times we can flush before I have to leave. And that was not a human who turned it off, that was the system. So imagine if you could spoof the system. There are sensors in roads and bridges everywhere. If you could spoof those sensors to say, bridge on 95 through Manhattan is about to fail. Are you going to take the chance that the sensor's wrong, or are you going to close the bridge and create traffic hell? But again, I don't like, all this is possible, but it hasn't happened. It's not, to the distributed point, it's not exactly easy, but this is the threats, the risk, and is the benefit outweigh it? Almost certainly yes, because we've developed a lot of efficiency, but we need to bake that security in.
Yeah, in the center, please, and then over to Jessica.
Thank you. You mentioned how good is the cooperation, the internal cooperation in terms of cybersecurity. But I'm interested on a global level, and especially US has many allies, let's say NATO, and I'm Bulgarian, so a NATO nation, small with not so good developed cybersecurity.
Yeah.
So from one hand, is US helping those allies to protect themselves, taking into account that those allies can be a channel for attack through which US can be reached?
So I actually went to Bulgaria when I worked at Symantec. So I can tell you on the corporate level, we worked with countries around the world, but on the international partner level from the US standpoint, very much so. We work with NATO, we work with what are called the Five Eyes, or the usual five. We work with ENISA, the European Cybersecurity Agency. I was at a NISA meeting in Athens a few weeks ago with the directors of almost every European cybersecurity agency. So we work very publicly, sharing threat information, sharing best practices, trying to work together on policies that we think will drive better security. But one of the things that we have seen in the cyber realm is sometimes attacks can start very localized outside of Australia, UK, France, US. And it is where adversaries, criminal or nation state, will test out what they can do. They're taking it for a dry run. And that is one of the important reasons for working with international partners. But also, some of these international partners, US partners, have a wealth of expertise that we do not have. And many of us, I like to think, are humble enough to realize that we don't begin to have all the answers here in the US, and it's important to have a global perspective, both in terms of what is the possible, but also in terms of what our international partners are seeing. So for us at CISA, we have partnerships with just about every computer emergency readiness or response, whatever they call it. Some of the certs all have different names across the world. I got an email, what day is today? Yesterday, saying, hey, there was X happened in Barbados, and Y is asking, can we help out? And I emailed the people who run our international partnerships, and the response was, oh yeah, we know X in their cert. We've already reached out and offered assistance. So we have those point connections with most countries around the world.
Hopefully it's a bit louder now. Okay, so my question was, you talked about kind of the evolving nature of both the attacks, I guess, that are being conducted and also the responses. The lay of the land approach you mentioned, and then also something that stuck with me was how patches, you said, used to take weeks to reverse engineer, and now it's a matter of days. So my question is, what strides have we seen in the past decade or past 2 decades, both on the part of cyber criminals in states and also in state responses to these attacks?
On the first part, it's not just states, it's criminal actors as well. 2 of the biggest, I think, are the barrier to entry for particularly cyber criminals is so much lower. You don't have to be technical. You can go onto the dark corners of the internet and buy an attack kit and then buy a list of potential victims. It's all commoditized. And then you just have to point and click, and you can become a ransomware actor. So for those of you who need some tuition money, that is available to you. I encourage you not to do it from the US though, because not a great place. You're more likely to get prosecuted. So that is a real problem, and that continues. But that also bridges over to the nation state. The attacks are easier. The living off the land, the movement away from signature-based attacks to taking advantage of administrative tools, default credentials, poor password management, poor access control is probably the most worrisome. There's a whole subset of devices. We talk about edge devices, firewalls, routers, SOHO, small office, home office routers that are incredibly insecure and that our adversaries are aggressively compromising and using to start. Volt Typhoon uses the edge devices and the living off the land very effectively. On the defensive side, I can use the Federal Civilian Executive Branch, the FCEB, as an example. We saw, when we looked back at SolarWinds, I was in the White House then, and there were a bunch of different reviews, like how could this have happened? How did this get through our defenses? And one of the key findings was, it's the cliche from 9/11 of not connecting the dots. We saw in the logs of some agencies events that we later correlated to the SolarWinds intrusion, but we didn't see enough of them and we weren't connecting them. So with help and money from Congress, we have deployed across many of the Federal Civilian Executive Branch agencies sophisticated endpoint protections, which detect activity and also share that data back. So what we are able to do is see an event if the EDR, endpoint detection and response, detects it, but we're also able to take weird stuff back and compare it to weird stuff in another agency. It might not be of a threshold that an individual agency tool is going to detect it, but when you put 3, 4, 7 together, so we have made great strides in protecting the Federal Civilian Executive Branch because of that tooling. Now that requires a lot of money and a lot of data, but it is, when I was there when we wrote the executive order that said you need to do this, being out for 2 years and coming back and seeing that, oh my God, we've actually done a lot of this. That is the single biggest pleasant surprise that I got when I came into CISA in June, was the remarkable improvement in Federal Civilian Executive Branch security and the malicious activity that we were detecting in very early stages because of it. This is working. Now we need to keep evolving, because every time we stop something, the bad guys or the adversary try to figure out, okay, we got caught, what else can we do? And then the last thing I would say is, on an individual level, the software you can put on your computer, there's less on cell phones. If you have an Android, you can do it. But the individual security software you can put out, if you keep your device updated, if you have that security software, will keep your device pretty secure from everything that's out there, if you add in that multi-factor authentication.
Yes.
So I'd like to throw a question in too, which is about the threat profile a little bit, right? Like you said at some point in the conversation, like China is our most worrisome adversary in the cyberspace. What would be the reasons and what would be the scenario in which China would launch a disruptive attack? Because I suspect that there'd be severe consequences to that, right? So how likely are we going to see something like that, and what would it look like?
So the descriptor I've heard is Russia is a hurricane, China is climate change. Very good long term. We have to worry about it. The when and why. The most obvious scenario is a conflict over Taiwan, the Taiwan Straits. But it is part of it is having the capacity no matter what happens. Now, economically, it would devastate both sides most likely. But I don't know how much I can say on this. Is what I'm thinking about. But you don't. It's not classified that the Chinese want to reunite with Taiwan, and that's a potential sore spot between the countries.
And it's not classified that the United States has capability that it may use in order to defend itself.
Humans are humans everywhere.
I think we can go to one more question, and then maybe we can get to a small group as we're mingling around for questions. Does anyone? Maybe?
I just want to ask a little bit about offensive cybersecurity. That's like your expertise, but thanks. Like, what's the effectiveness of offensive, kind of in defending ourselves, if that makes sense?
It does. I can't really say anything about that.
Okay, worth a shot.
Yeah. Not a bad question. Are we going to get out of here without anyone saying AI? That will make my night if we can get out of here without anyone saying
You want to talk about quantum?
Yeah. Quantum, that's a very scary problem if you haven't dug into it.
So whenever we talk about cybersecurity, it can become pretty depressing. I mean, I could listen to Jeff talk, and then I'm going to listen to James Taylor tonight and get really depressed, right? So what are the top 3 things on a positive note that the United States is doing when it comes to cybersecurity and defense?
Number one is working with international partners, an awareness that we do not have all of the answers. We need international partners beyond the U5 or the Five Eyes. We have very robust partnerships around the world. I think number 2 is the internal U.S. government coordination that we have seen evolve dramatically from even when I was at the White House 4 years ago in cyberspace. CISA's capacity to work with FBI, NSA, and others, the information sharing back and forth there makes us much quicker. And the third thing, I would probably say that for the most part, the private sector partnership, it's bumpy. But actually what I'll say is I touched on it before, the way we push out and share information. The line that I've used that was probably in my notes and I forgot it is like the days of if only are over. When I was working on the Hill, when I was in the private sector, there was this refrain, if only the government had told us we could have prevented this attack. If only the government had shared X or Y. There's no if only anymore. If we have it, we're sharing it out pretty quickly. And that to me is an enormous development. We know it internally. We need that to sink in the private sector, that we're all in this together. And you can't sit around waiting for the cavalry to ride in, because you need to do your own work. We're giving everything we can, but that is incredibly positive. We have to get that sunk in.
Jeff, I want to thank you for your time. I mean, just so everyone realizes, Washington, D.C. and Boston are pretty close, but based on how busy you've been, they haven't been close enough. So the fact that you could take time out and spend with us has been wonderful. Since I can see you on your phone, you're getting to be a good 15-year-old texter.
Yes.
With working.
I miss my BlackBerry. The keyboard was better.
But we want to thank you for your time, and but more importantly, I want to thank you for everything you're doing every day, as well as CISA is doing to keep us safe.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks again.